Hi everybody. In this video render video, we're going to take a look at the creation of this Lovecraftian inspired image. This image was created using Twinmotion 2024, Zbrush, Substance Painter, and blending everything together in Photoshop. I'll run through the steps taken. I'll also provide some suggestions for alternative software if you don't have the software that we're talking about. And at the very end, I'll explain what I would probably do different if I was going to do this image again. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, everybody. So step one is the creation of our actual monster. In order to do this, I'd strongly recommend looking at, firstly, some reference images. There's some really fantastic Lovecraftian Cthulhu-style monster artwork out there. So go check out some really good reference images just to give you an idea of the overall direction you want your creature or monster to go in. I created mine in Zbrush 2022. If I pull the camera back here, you can just kind of see how this is done. And so what I did was take one of the default starting human figures, convert it to a Dynamesh, so basically make it where any changes you make can be retopologized on the fly, and then really just sculpting in the base shapes. I want to keep the anatomy fairly basic. We don't want to add a huge amount of detail in ZBrush. And the key to this was just really making the head a lot more kind of bulbous, almost like football style, American football or rugby. Just kind of stretching the cranium a little bit. And then when it comes to the facial features, one of the things that kind of matters is going to be, I think, a little bit the eyes. And when it comes to sort of creatures like this, there's kind of a distinction made between creatures of intelligence and sort of just basic animals. And the more humanoid you tend to make the face, the more the eyes do kind of a bit of the heavy lifting, I think. And so we've gone for a very heavy brow. We want it to look like this creature is quite old because, again, it's Lovecraftian, but also that it's not just an animal. We want to give it some sort of almost like kind of facial expression. In addition to this, the clay tubes brush was used to build everything up. And I also want to just show you really quickly here, we've got the curve tube brush, which is one of the insert multi-meshes. Now, this brush itself will only work on models that have no subdivision level. You'll notice as I try and drag this out, it doesn't work. So once you get your Dynamesh to a pretty decent spot, what we do is actually just go ahead and use retopologize on this. Now, we just use the auto remesher within ZBrush. If you want to do this properly, you probably do want to manually retopologize the entire sculpt and then start with basically a sculpt with 0 subdivision levels. And that's what I did here to add all of these tubes. Now, I did have symmetry on, and then what you want to do is turn symmetry off so you can add some more individual, these kind of tendrils, these tubes that are coming out of the mouth, these feelers, basically. After that, in order to get a high level of detail, what we do is split the mesh apart, and my mesh splitting was very, very ugly. You can see I've got a really big, ugly seam here. It's not the prettiest thing. Again, doesn't really matter per se. If you're not going to see where that separation of the meshes is, you can actually just get away with kind of carving the head. And I really should have carved the wings as well. Once that's done, you can start sculpting detail and also use poly paint. Now, once you get to this point where you've sculpted some of the larger anatomical forms, and again, it's been 10 years since I used ZBrush, so this was definitely kind of having to go back and relearn a little bit. But once you get the basic forms in, because he's in a T-pose kind of shape, we're kind of in a pretty good spot. We sculpt what we want to be able to extract the normal map detail, and then I just started using poly paint to just add in a thin layer. Please note, the poly paint is really just going to be the base layer in Substance Painter, and Substance Painter is going to be doing pretty much most of the heavy lifting for this. If you don't have ZBrush, and I realize ever since Maxon bought ZBrush, there's been a very strong backlash where people refuse to buy it because of the subscription model, and I totally understand that. I'm lucky I have a legacy version of ZBrush that was bought sometime in 2014, probably, and they've continued the older Pixelogic. Let people update it for free every year if you just bought it once. Probably the single best business model for software in terms of how you deal with your customers. but I'm not using the newer ZBrush versions, and I think a lot of people aren't as well. So ZBrush 22, perfectly fine. If you don't have ZBrush, you do have a couple of options. The first is Mudbox from Autodesk, but Mudbox is pretty much, I think, effectively dead software at this point. And even though you can get Mudbox for about $10 a month, $120 a year, it's just impossible to recommend Mudbox at this stage. Alternatives to ZBrush the Professional, you have ZBrush itself, which, if you do want to buy it, you can go to the Maxon website. But we've got two really cheaper options. The first is ZBrush Core Mini, which is effectively the free version of ZBrush. It's designed to get people up and running with sculpting, and it's a really fun little tool. It's got some nice features, and you can export, I believe, in OBJ. Now, the snake hook is what you'll probably use if you want to do something with tendrils. All in all, this will be enough to get you up and running in the creation of some sort of monster-style sculpts. Another option is Sculpt GL. Again, no longer being developed. I believe the developer has moved on to kind of work on the iOS app, which I think is paid, or maybe it's the Android app. Either way, not developing the web version, but this is effectively a web version of really ZBrush's Dynamesh. It's a dynamic tessellation. So as you make changes to the sculpt, it sort of updates the geometry on the fly or tessellates it as it needs be. And again, you should be able to export. At the very least, you should be able to get an OBJ out. And if you can't get any sort of poly data or texture materials, don't worry about that. Just export the sculpted model and we'll pick it up in Substance Painter. So we've got a few options. The other option is Blender. It is free for everybody and it's really, really great. So Blender sculpting is definitely a viable way to go. Does, however, come with, I think, quite a steep learning curve. You have to kind of be familiar with Blender itself, and Blender is very beautiful, but quite quirky in places. And it's not ZBrush at the end of the day. And that's one of the issues with all of these other programs is they're all good in their own way, but, they're not ZBrush. So there you go. One thing to note, the poly paint was taken from ZBrush and exported as basically a diffuse, not albedo, I think it's a diffuse still, texture map. Now, it didn't really look very great, honestly. It's an okay base, but you can see if I'm on the head right here, you can see if we just kind of look at the actual material, really it's going to be Substance Painter that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. In fact, a lot of the skin material was really kind of reworked quite a bit here. A lot of the really magic for this, for making it look a lot better, is going to come from the substance materials. Poly paint in ZBrush is a much nicer way to do airbrushing style texture maps. However, they don't automatically translate really to Substance Painter because it is just a single flat diffuse texture. And so really, in order to get this looking good, you're going to have to go in and do a lot of magic in Substance Painter. And these materials that we got and used are really going to help quite a bit. In order to get the best materials, what you'll actually need to do is go out of Substance Painter and actually go, if we go over here to the Substance 3D asset. You'll want to take a look through both the official Substance 3D assets and then the community assets for Substance Painter. And you can see here, we've kind of overridden quite a lot of that poly paint, and we slowly just built up the layers with different skin materials. And so I don't have them to hand right now, but we're using a lot. We're using human skin, we're using alien skin, just trying to build up that texture and make it look like you've got effectively kind of multiple layers going on here. In other words, try and give the illusion of subsurface scattering. Now, the other thing that was really interesting, here is you can see this is the normal map on this layer right here, and this is the one that we extracted effectively from ZBrush. But overall, you just build up, adding different materials and adding a lot of imperfections. And then we added some dirt as well. And then we made sure to make sure that the top layer is extremely specular. We want it to look like, as this creature is coming out of the water is like sticking to the skin, but also giving the impression that the skin itself is wet or oily, almost like there's kind of a sort of layer of oil or something on the skin. Very, very shiny surface. Once all of your material and texture work is done, and you can see the eyes, we don't really have much going on for there, but the body itself, again, very similar to the head. We start off with our basic sort of diffuse map that came out of Zbrush. And you can see we've got a lot of different materials at work here, really kind of trying to get that alien sort of look to the skin. We want it to look very kind of like amphibian-like, a little bit like almost like a frog-like skin or texture. And one other issue I have here is I didn't bother putting any details on the wings. I tried painting opacity within Substance Painter on the wings because in my mind I was thinking, okay, these wings will be very thin and translucent, almost like bat wings or like vampire wings. But that just didn't actually work very well. So the wings look terrible, and yeah, there's no other way to put it. They're just bad. Once we get to this point, all we need to do is go ahead and export out our textures. Now, one thing we do want to mention is posing and UVs. Now, if you are not comfortable doing UVs by hand, or in my case, you're just lazy and slightly pushed for time, you can always go up to the Z plugin menu, and we're just going to use UV Master. And so what this will do is just do an auto UV unwrap. Now, it's not going to be the best UV unwrap, and it certainly will not look as good as one done by hand. It's not a very optimized use of that 0 to 1 UV space. However, it'll get the job done. The other alternative is just go directly from exporting this mesh over Substance Painter and ask Substance Painter to do an auto UV unwrap as well. Again, neither of them are very good per se. They're not like as good as a handmade one, but they will work in a pinch. And especially if you're UV unwrapping something and you're working with a 4K texture, you can get away with a lot of problems with that UV space just because really this model is going to be quite far back in our finished shot. One way or the other, you'll have to pose the model. And in order to pose this model, again, we just went to Z plugins and used Transpose Master. Really all I needed to depict was the monster sort of standing up and coming out of the water, so there wasn't a huge amount of joint manipulation that was very much necessary. Really, you just want to rotate the torso, rotate the head a little bit, and maybe lift up one of the hands, so it kind of seems like it's just coming out of the water. Now, as long as you use effectively the same mesh with the same UV coordinates, when you pose this model, it will still retain that UV data. And once we send this over to Twinmotion, we'll be sending the posed model, which will have, again, the same UV data. So the textures will apply perfectly fine. It's just that the model will now be posed. Okay, everyone. So you're done with the sculpting, the UVs, and hopefully the creation of the textures from Substance Painter. Here we are in Twinmotion. Now, sorry about that. Now, the idea for this image actually came from the Twinmotion Friday exercise challenges. And so one of the impetuouses to get this shot done was really because they kind of only last about a week. And so this was the model that was available from the Epic community page, which is basically just will link out to usually a very nice SketchUp model, and users will download this model and try their best to recreate it in Twinmotion and make it look as amazing as possible. And you can see very much a modern home design, everyone's most overused and ugliest home style out there, modern. But all in all, it's fine. The model was absolutely fine, but we needed context for the actual shot. And so this whole section of the scene was effectively just done the way you'd normally work with a Twinmotion project. The materials had to be set up correctly, and then lights had to be added. Now, because we were going for a very moody atmospheric shot, these lights in the scene are ridiculously overpowered. I mean, we've got lights multiple lights within this shot, and they're all blasting light outwards with shadows on, with full, very far attenuation, trying to give the impression of light in the house spilling outside. Now, everything else was done very traditionally. Grass was added, outside materials, and if we actually pull the camera further back, you will also notice that we decorated a little bit around the house. Originally, I thought a lot more of this to the left and right of the house would be visible, but it is not in the finished shot. But nevertheless, it's good practice just to kind of close up the gaps and just make sure those horizon lines are hidden. Because I sort of had this idea in my head that this would be a very almost Scandinavian Nordic look, which is not the most common biome in Twinmotion because it only kind of suits kind of coastal areas. But because we wanted this to be kind of coastal themes, you have to use some of these really nice mega scans from the Nordic sort of beach rock collection. Now, you'll also notice that this is very high up off the 000 spot or the ground plane origin. Now, the reason for that is in order to make our Cthulhu-style monster, our Lovecraftian-style monster look very big, if you had the camera, you could put them down low and have the camera looking up, but we want it to look like this thing is coming out of the water and is sort of as big as the cliffs around it. And that meant lifting up all of this area and making sure we had effectively this big drop or fall off, as if this house was perched kind of precariously just on a cliff edge and is just overlooking the water. Now, in order to add a bit more scale, we also added a lot of these really beautiful Megascan cliff objects. And when it comes to this, you kind of just want to make sure that the horizon is hidden. You can kind of see that over here on the left. And again, we're using them for scale. Now, some of these were shoved really, really, really far back just to give that impression of like, this is again a coastal landscape and you've got islands really far off the coast. You'll also notice we have the ocean turned on, and the ocean was raised a little bit. It is, I believe, the default ocean color. Looks good. The waves are probably a little too frantic. I wish there was a means to kind of slow those down a little bit. I don't think there is. But all in all, this looks, to me, pretty nice. The car vehicle was added here just, again, to help with scale, and also the single person in the shot. And we just added one of the generic kind of people. This dude kind of looks like he would live in one of these ugly modern homes because he's got a sports jacket on. And we wanted him to look a bit haunting. So we used this lamp model, which comes from the SketchUp library. And we added a light in there again, shadows turned on. Very bright light, very strong, very unrealistically strong light, but we did want that kind of haunting shadow look. Once you get to this point, it's important to bring in your actual model. And in this case, we're going to just show our Lovecraftian model. And you can see we brought it in. Did have to scale it up massively just because Zbrush's internal scale tends to be really different to pretty much every other program out there. Some of the weird fun quirks of Zbrush. So we scaled it up massively and then had to load the textures individually one by one. And all in all, I'm very happy with the look. The parallax isn't working very well, the height map, but you know, whatever. So if we click on just the body here, you can see in the relative slots, we have details. This is the diffuse texture map. For the most part, that was the poly paint from Zbrush with another pass done in Substance Painter itself. Very nice. And then we scroll on down here a little bit because it's UV unmapped. We don't have to worry about the UVs at all. And then on the roughness slider, we actually have our roughness texture. You can see kind of letting the texture map do a lot of the heavy lifting here. But by default, we put this in here and just drop the intensity to 0. If we take it to the right, you can see there's kind of, it just removes it completely. So it's very specular, very shiny, which is kind of what we wanted. I did experiment with the clear coat. It didn't work. As simple as it just didn't work. So then metallic, obviously, this is a black metallic map because there is no metal in your actual creature here. We have our normal map, which is really doing just a staggering amount of the work here. You can see the body here. Without all those normal details from all those wonderful substance materials, it just doesn't look good. And lastly, we did add the height map. It's, you know, I don't really love this. Most of these programs, you know, Twinmotion or D5, their version of height mapping or parallax doesn't really work very well on anything that just isn't a flat plane. I don't understand the technical reasons for that. It just doesn't. Probably because it doesn't actually tessellate the surface, just gives the illusion of it, but there's no true displacement going on because there's no subdivision levels. That's my theory. Somebody much smarter than me can probably correct me on that. Anyway, we do have our parallax map in. You can see just kind of put it at a very slight intensity, just giving those nice impression of more surface depth. And in conclusion, this is not a texture map that you can actually get, to the best of my knowledge, from Substance Painter. I'm probably very wrong on that. So what I actually did was just export a cavity map from Zbrush, basically just using the Zbrush masking and cavities just to create a black and white cavity map. And it's in there. And it's not, strictly speaking, this is not an AO map. It is a cavity map. So much finer details, and it's just shoved into the slot here. Very little impact, but just a smidge. And sometimes a smidge is just enough to get the result you want. Again, that's a cavity map, not an AO map. And lastly, the eyes here. You know, I was really pushed for time, and also I couldn't be bothered to do a really good job on the eyes. I knew from looking at some of the reference images, I just wanted like red glowing eyes because, you know, it's that part of that sort of hauntingly creepy Lovecraftian cosmic horror vibe. And so there are maps attached to this, but really the only thing that matters is the emissive slider. Now, the emissive value is really low because my understanding on the emissive material is it's not quite just about how strong the material is, it's also how large the surface area that is actually emitting light. So very, very weak. And yet, look, I just love the look of that. There's so much more I wish I could have done with the eyes, but good enough is good enough. And you can see those super gross looking tentacles. Now, the overall environment for this was a utter nightmare, not going to lie. This is what we settled on. And I have Lumen enabled right now, just so we can see this in real time. The Path Tracer version is very similar to this, a little bit better across the board. But I just have Lumen on just so my computer won't explode. So you can see very, very dark, very dramatic atmosphere. This is one of the default HDRI skies, low sun overcast 29, rotated behind just to get the best result we could possibly get. Emissive materials coming from the lights above the pool. And again, super strong lights coming from here on the right. The problem with this is this image is okay, but it just kind of lacks a little bit of oomph. So what we did was steal an old method. I say old, there are a lot of people who still use this, especially ZBrush character artists out there, which is basically just rendering in passes. Because ZBrush doesn't have really physically based materials and it doesn't have physically based lighting, what we do is we basically render out in ZBrush different matte cap passes, and each one of those acts as a different style of lighting, and then you smush them together in Photoshop, trying to blend between all these different matte caps. So what we did here was to create about 3 or 4 different render passes. So let's take a look. This is our default. We also have a slightly different one here where you're getting a lot more of the specular details in our actual, Cthulhu style character. And then lastly, we also have this one, which is really it's a lot of the blues that are coming through in this. And then lastly, what I really wanted was the ability to have a much lighter layer that I could overlay. And so let me pull all of these final render passes up really quickly. So you can see this is just my project file. So here was our different render passes that we sort of did. We've got a couple of different variations on this. So again, this is our little specular friend. I like the look of him. This is our really dramatic skies with a strong glow. And then we also have this one, which has got a lot of color information. I really, really like the look of this. You do see a lot of that diffuse texture map. And then lastly, this little guide. In order to get a pass like this out of Twinmotion, really what you just have to do is hide everything else except your creature. And then I changed the sky to just one of the more photographic skies. These are the ones that are the lighting, studio lighting environments. And then I just changed the material. I think this was the matte material. And what we'll end up doing is using this in a sort of overlay fashion within Photoshop. Okay, so we render out all of these, and back in Twinmotion, if we want to just look at our render settings really quickly, I'll just run through these. So the primary image, the main one that we liked, is this one here. So this was set to render not in Lumen, but the path tracer, default high, and just make sure you do a quick test render, just to make sure you like it, a little 2K fast one, just to see if it looks okay. So in terms of environment settings, you can see here we've got the sun setting set to 1, and I think on this we did just leave the ambient at 1 as well. The HRI we've already talked about. I tried to add as much fog as humanly possible. If I was doing this in the newer version of Twinmotion, I'd have better controls over the fog, but you can kind of see this gives that impression of fog coming up. I did not render this strong enough. I wish I'd made the fog a lot stronger. On top of that, our camera setting, we've got a manually set exposure, manually adjusted white balance, and then we did tweak the local exposure just to get the results we want. We did have focal length set to this case 26, and we had no depth of field on. We also turned on vignetting and a little bit of sharpness and parallelism. And so in all of our other shots, it's the same camera settings. The only thing that changes is the HRI, and you absolutely cannot move the camera. So what you do is you just go down to each individual image and click duplicate, and then you just change the sky in the duplicate and then render it out. All right, let's take a look at our Photoshop elements. So here in Photoshop, this is our 8K final sort of shot here. And this is the one that we really liked initially. And you can see we've got our other render passes. And so how this generally kind of works is, first thing we want to do is maybe using the black and white image, you want to make a selection of your Cthulhu character. The selection is what's going to be used to drive the masks, and is going to be used to allow you to do your paint overlays. So this kind of works, you're just putting layer on top of layer on top of layer. So for example, if I wanted the specular from, let's grab this little guy here, we'll do Control A, Control C, and we'll paste this little fella right here. And what we mean by layering these on is really quite simple. Just put the layer on top and change the blend mode. So for example, I would have gone for the shadows. If we zoom in quite a little bit here, you can see this layer is going to sit on top, change to blend mode, so I get the overlay effect going on. And if you have a selection saved, really what you can do is just load up that selection and then use it to paint out the areas with masks that you don't actually want. So this was my actual Photoshop project, now that you guys understand how this kind of works. And we've got all of our layers stacked here. And you can see if I alt click on the mask, there's a bit of a smudgy hand-painted mask. But that's really just the process. On top of this, we added more atmospheric fog, just using brushes and painting it on. Very low opacity, very low strength. This is kind of what I mean when I say I wish I had done the fog in Twinmotion. I wish I had just put more work into the Twinmotion side of things. And I thought I'd be able to paint in a lot of this stuff more easily than I could, but I wasn't. There you go. Now, we've also got some more adjustment layers going on up here. And then finally, when we were happy with the overall look of those merged version of those 4 images, I actually went in and used Camera Raw to start making some very tangible tweaks to the overall image. We also use the burn and dodge tools to selectively lighten and darken parts of the image to make it look a little bit better. We also added a few more adjustment layers, and I believe in total we used Camera Raw twice. The first was to make all the major adjustments, and then the second time was to find really some sort of presets that I thought kind of added a little bit. And you can see that's where the mattification of this image comes from. We have a mattifying sort of adjustment layer that worked in Camera Raw just to make this look a little bit more matte. Once we were done with that, we just added our logo, and that was pretty much it. And so overall, I was really happy with this and really happy to post it to the Twinmotion community group on Facebook. And so before we leave off, I'm just going to take a minute to talk about the things that I wish I had done and say if the things I would do if I was doing this. So just in a retrospective, which I personally think is kind of important to do whenever you kind of go outside of your normal lane, or you just finish a big project and you're thinking, how can I improve going forward? What would I do differently, or what would I change? Well, the first thing is the time limit. If you're going to make some, kind of, I don't know, more stylized artwork in Twinmotion, or you're using it for Twinmotion, not just to show off renders of pretty homes and things like that, time is kind of does matter. Trying to get this done in basically all of this done in a weekend and a handful of weekdays after work was a dumpster fire, quite simply. If you want to do it well, take time. Really, I would have loved to have had 2 or 3 weeks. I should not have tried to fit this in at the same time as doing that community challenge. So I think really that was a big mistake on my behalf. Just not worth the hassle. Second thing, this got me back into Zbrush, which I'm really happy with. It's been really, I think, close to 10 years since I last used Zbrush. And this was when I was in college after my degree, and I wanted to get into the games industry like a lot of people did. I'd put it away for a long time. So it was great to go back. Problem is, when you've been gone from something for years, getting back, it takes quite a long time. Stuff will come back to you. That's awesome. But trying to do it again within a time frame, a narrow time frame, was really dumb on my behalf. Really, I should have spent a few weeks getting back into ZBrush and revisiting everything again and learning about the new stuff since I had stopped using it, and I didn't. So, again, time. Third thing, silhouette, silhouette, and silhouette. If I was doing this again, obviously I would have taken a lot more time with the sculpt. I would have made the sculpts look a lot better. And I think what I really would have concentrated on is getting it as good looking as possible within ZBrush. Basically working on the overall silhouette of the object. It should have been a lot more readable than it actually was. I would have done more work on the wings and made them just look better. Actually fully sculpted the wings and not just put them on there and think I'll hide it later. And I really would have made the face a lot more alien looking, a lot more unpleasant looking, I think is a good way to put it, a lot more disturbing to look at as well. And I would have zeroed in a lot more on the anatomy. I was happy to be able to remember some of the anatomical points, try and hit some markers, things like that. But really, I would have gone in and tried to do this a lot better. And I would have done a lot more sculpting of probably using a vector displacement map just to get all those tentacles and to get suckers and all these gross bits on the tentacles. I think I would have tried to make it look a lot more alien to begin with. Substance Painter-wise, very happy with how it went in Substance Painter, because Substance Painter is just brilliant and I love using it, and was really happy with the quality of the bake and the masks that came out of that. So if we're looking at it then, the next thing I want to think about is talking about Twinmotion. I really think, again, had we ignored this house here, we would have gone for something a little more less modern, because I hate modern homes and they're just so done to death. I did like the overall atmosphere that I was able to get by making it look, I think, a little bit more ominous and creepy, but I probably would have massively changed the camera. Instead of trying to show off the home because of the community challenge brief, I really just kind of would have made it look like a really isolated cabin. Or put them on a beach. Would have been even easier. Just would have been nicer if the camera was lower and our creature would have looked a lot more imposing as well. I think I would have just really brought the camera in a lot closer. And I think that would have helped quite a bit. It also is a shame to have so much details. I do like how this thing looks. Again, pretty happy with it. But you lose a lot of details when your camera is so far back and the image is just so far dark. I probably would have also stuck to a much more basic color palette. In fact, I would have just picked a color palette to begin with. In other words, try and go for a very definitive, maybe just a haunting green or very blue palette. I think that in hindsight I would have done. And with that being said, we are done. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it. This is very different to what we normally do, but as somebody in the comments pointed out, you know, Twinmotion tutorials about houses have kind of gotten boring, so sometimes it's really fun to do something different. And I think it's fun to try something creative and something that is just a little bit out of the normal realm for us. And it's great to be able to do that with Twinmotion now. Twinmotion is more than just an architectural rendering software, and it's starting to very much become the Unreal Engine Lite. And I think there's some just magnificent things you can do with that. All right, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video pretty soon. All right, cheers.